So what we've been working on in the Path of Tantra in terms of the meditation part is working on the 4 thoughts that turn the mind, which is the common nundro. And the 4 thoughts that turn the mind are basically a way of helping motivate us to do the practice. So when we think about the fact that the thing is impermanent, that there is suffering, that we get caught up in karma and reincarnation, if we don't do anything, all of those things then come together in a way that help us to feel like we want or need to do the practice, or at least that's the basic idea behind this. Could use a few more positive kinds of influences perhaps, but it is a way of helping us get in touch with the need and the importance of that. So now we're going to move on to the next part, which is the uncommon. And these are uncommon because they're not taught in all of the different traditions. They are taught in the Path of Tantra and all the different lineages as a part of that. So they are common, if you will, at that level, but they are not taught in the path of the Bodhisattva. They are not taught in the path of individual liberation, at least not in the same way that they are here. They're elements of it, perhaps. And so the first one that we're going to look at today is Refuge and Bodhicitta. And of course, Bodhicitta is part of the path of the Bodhicitta or Bodhisattva. And so that is common at that level. Taking refuge is also common across the tradition. So it's not exclusive to the path of Tantra. So typically what is done, the way that this is approached, is that the tantric path includes all of these things. So there's 5 that are a part of the uncommon practices. So we have refuge and bodhicitta, which are sometimes combined together as we're going to do, which then we would have 4. So there's either 4 or 5. And then we have the vajrasattva purification practice. It would be the first of our real deity practices that we engage in. And then the mandala offerings, so we're then making an offering to the deities, and guru yoga, which is probably the key practice of all of these. In fact, it is said that with guru yoga alone you can attain enlightenment. So it's a very, very important part of the practice. Question?
In the path of liberation, do you take refuge?
Yes.
So in all the paths?
All the paths take refuge, yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, so traditionally, each of these 5 or 4 are repeated 100,000 times. So the prayer, the mantra, or whatever it is that's associated with it, you would repeat those 100,000 times each. A lot of Western students look at that and they kind of say, wait a minute, what's going on here? But it's actually preliminary. We call them the preliminary practices, and it's preliminary for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons that it is preliminary is that it prepares you for the advanced practices. So it gives you some basic understanding, some basic experience that then leads into these other more advanced practices. So that's one of the reasons. The other one is that it has to do with your preparation, your seriousness, if you will, about going on. So you look at that, you say, are you serious? I really have to do that many times? And the Lama says, yes. And that's kind of a test, if you will, of your will and whether or not you're willing to do that. On the other hand, given the fact that with our lives, our busy lives, we don't always have the ability to do that the way others would. I mentioned previously, for example, that if you were to do these 10 a day, that it would take you 30 years to complete these, which is not a very realistic way to get through the practices. And there are some other approaches. It's not strictly do 100,000 of each of these, or 400, or the total of 500, whichever organization of it is involved. But in fact, there are at least a couple of other ways. One of the teachers that we have had here at Dharma College, for example, has said, if you would do these practices for 1 year, that's your main practice for a full year. If you've got other things, just set them aside for this year. Focus on the Nundro practices. So that's another approach. Still another approach is the one that Padmasambhava seems to be emphasizing here, which is simply that you do it initially for a period of 3 days, and then you do a short version of it as preliminary to your daily practice. And you do that indefinitely, for the rest of your life, if you will. And so you start your practice, your daily practice, by doing a short version of Nundro. And even though I have completed a full set of these in an abbreviated form, I still do this every day as a part of my practice. I start off with a short version of the Nundro each day.
Also with the common one?
There's a shortened version of it included in there. And we'll see that. We'll actually, once we get through all of these, I'll give you that short version, which is based on one that was written by His Holiness Juja Rinpoche. And it's in there. It's embedded in there. And for those of you who are doing it, the prayer book that we use on our Sunday practice, it's included in there as well. Okay? So that's the basic idea of how we go about doing these. And one other thing I wanted to mention is that in Dzogchen there's also a set of preliminary practices. And so when we get to that, we'll also take a look at those preliminary practices. And according to at least some in that tradition, those can actually replace these. But most people follow this more traditional approach of going through the regular Nundro and the generation completion stage practices before doing Dzogchen, which is the approach that we're following here. So let's talk a little bit then about refuge. And so refuge is the first vow that most of us take, the first initiation into the practice. And oftentimes that then is what we do as a way with our lama. It may be one of the first lamas that you meet. It may be somebody that you've actually practiced with for a while. And you go through something called the Refuge Ceremony. It's a very brief ceremony, but in that you take the refuge vow as a part of that, and you get a blessing from the Lama to do the practice, as well as you often in the Tibetan tradition receive a Tibetan name. So my Tibetan name, I actually have two of them, and are combined Drime Dawa, which means brilliant moon. It's kind of a nice combination. And so then with my title in front of that, we have Khenpo Drime Dawa, although I typically go by Khenpo Dean, more Western version, or just Dean for that matter. I'm not real formal about those things. And so we go through that as part of the ceremony, and some would say that's the point at which you become a Buddhist. Okay, is taking refuge. And so if you've not done that, when a Lama comes to town, if you're interested in doing that, then you can ask, and oftentimes they will do a refuge ceremony. Sometimes people will do it multiple times, but you really only need to do it just once.
Can I ask one question, Tom?
Okay.
When you do it separate, because I have several names.
Uh-huh.
Which one do you choose?
You choose. You just choose.
Right.
Okay.
Just wondering.
Yeah.
I have several cards.
Yeah. And so the actual practice itself has three parts to it as we go through this. The first part is a visualization, and what we visualize is called a refuge tree. And I'll describe that a little bit for you. I probably should have brought some to give to you so you could look at that. On the website, we actually have one associated with the lineage of our spiritual master, Khinchen Lama. And so you can look at that. And so the idea is that we do this visualization. So as we're reciting the vow, then that's the second part, is the actual recitation. And doing a prostration, that's the third part. We do those all together, which makes it rather necessary to memorize it. You can read it and go ahead and do that, but it's much easier to do those three things together if you actually memorize it. And the refuge vow that we use is a rather simple one. It's very easy for someone to memorize, especially when you've done it 100,000 times or less. So those are the three parts. You can also find versions of refuge trees on the internet very easily. There are lots of those. Each lineage or each branch lineage within the major lineages have their own refuge tree, and so it's very easy to find those. You can print them out or print them on photo paper to get a really good copy that you can use for this practice. And if you are, the one that we're using happens to be with the Nyingma lineage, but if you happen to be from another lineage or prefer a different lineage, you can use the one associated with that lineage as well. And so the basic design of the visualization, the refuge tree, is that the deity is in the center. Now in the Nyingma lineage, the figure that is at the center is Padmasambhava. Okay, he was the founder of the lineage, and so here on the very front of our book is a picture of Padmasambhava surrounded by a bunch of other figures in the lineage. This is not the refuge tree. It's a little bit different pattern than a refuge tree has, but it gives you the idea. And so that figure is in the center. On the figure's right-hand side are the Buddhas. Okay, so there's usually 3 or more figures there that represent the Buddhas. Then moving around behind are the Dharma Texts. And usually you'll see those in the form of texts, if you're familiar with the ones that are used by the lamas that have a loose leaf cover on them and loose leaf pages. So you may have a red cover. Some of them are bound with leather and stuff, are very nice. Others are just red paper. And then the white pages, and then a red backing on it as well. And just imagine those being stacked up several high, and big versions. So they stick out from either side behind him. So if you look at the images, what you'll often see are just the edges of some of those Pecha texts sticking out in the back of Padmasambhava or whoever the deity figure is in that refuge tree. On the other side, on the left-hand side, are some of the Bodhisattvas. So we have the figure in the center, we have the Buddhas, the Dharma Texts, and the Bodhisattvas are the key figures there. Then, in addition to that, we have the Dharma Protectors, or sometimes there's a primordial Buddha, different versions of the primordial Buddha. It might be Vajradhara, it might be Samattabhadra with Samattabhadri, and so forth, usually pictured right above the central figure. And then in addition to that, down below, usually in a kind of an arc down below, are various Dharma Protectors. They're typically in kind of a wrathful form, surrounded by fire, which is the primordial fire of wisdom that burns away all obscurations, symbolically speaking. And so we have all of those, and then there are also Dharma Dakinis and Dakas and other figures around. And then up above those, either across the top or in a kind of a pillar formation up above, are the lineage of the actual practice itself. And so key figures from that lineage as it has come down will be depicted in that. Sometimes the most important ones are kind of in a column going up the center, and then there may be some kind of cloud formations full of various figures around them. So that's the basic pattern. And you can almost tell a refuge tree because they all follow that same kind of a pattern, if you will. Some of them are a little bit more distinct and different than that, but most of them kind of follow that pattern. And so the second part then is the actual refuge prayer itself that we recite. And there are different levels of refuge. Now, a lot of the prayers only do the first one, which is the outer refuge. And that's the more traditional way. But sometimes they will also include an inner refuge, a secret refuge, or even a most secret refuge as a part of that. The outer refuge is the refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Okay? And so that's what we typically do. I take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, most excellent. Most excellent comes at the end of a lot of these. And so the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. The Buddha is the historic Buddha. The Dharma are the teachings of the Buddha. And the Sangha is the community. Now there are also multiple levels of Sangha. So the basic level of Sangha is anyone who is a practitioner would be considered a part of the Sangha. Also, anyone that is a member of a particular Buddhist group would be considered a Sangha. And then there are also members of the ordained Sangha. All the monks and nuns and so forth are considered to be a part of a Sangha. Another level of Sangha is all of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas themselves. The enlightened beings are considered to be a Sangha. So there's different levels that are being referenced when we talk about the Sangha. But these are all our source of support. The support of the Buddha, the support in the form of the teacher, the form of the Dharma teachings themselves, which we typically have in writing or passed on to us orally, and then the support that we get from our friends, our Dharma friends, as a part of the group that we participate in. So there are the multiple levels. So we did the outer. The inner level are the guru, the yidam, and the dakini. And some will also add Dharma Protectors to that. So instead of 3, there are actually 4 in those cases. So the guru, in this case, represents the Buddha. The yidam is the deity that you're using as a part of your practice, and as you move along, you will identify through one or other method who your particular deity is, or you may vary. You may start with one and then move on to another and so forth. But the deity represents the deity that is the focus of your attention. And then the dakini, there's also different levels of dakinis, but basically they represent the feminine. The dakini means sky goer or sky dancer, something like that. And so the divine feminine is the essence of what is being represented here. Now that can be anything from a female deity to any female human being can be considered a dakini. And so there are also different levels of those, and we'll talk more about that when we get into some of those related practices. And then the secret level is, there are 2 different versions of this, but the most common one is the Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Nirmanakaya. The word kaya means body. And so we put those together, we have 3 different versions of the body. So the first one, a Dharmakaya, literally means truth body. And so it's not an actual body, even though we may see it personified in some way. So we may see it personified in the form of Samattabhadra, for example. And even though it's not really a body, it's a reference to the truth of the Dharma. So it's beyond, it transcends an actual body, but it's referred to as a truth body. And then the Sambhogakaya, which literally means enjoyment body, is a reference more to the deities. And so when we talk about the deities, we'll often see references to them as being like a rainbow. That is, you can see them, but they're transparent. You can also see right through them. And so when we do these visualizations of the deities, we visualize them not as solid matter, the way we would our own bodies, but as something that we can see through. One of the best analogies that I've come up with, just coincidentally one day, was looking in not a mirror, but a glass window. When you look at a glass window, but you're in the light, you can see a reflection of yourself, but you can also look right through it to what's on the other side. And what becomes dominant depends on what you focus on. If you focus on yourself, it's almost like everything else disappears. If you focus on what's on the other side of the window, then the image of yourself almost disappears. That's very much like what we're talking about in terms of the visual image aspect of these yidams. You might think of them as something like a spirit or an energy form or something like that, whatever works for you in that matter, in that way. But that's the basic essence of that. And then the last one, the Nirmanakaya, is the actual physical form. So when we talk about Shakyamuni Buddha, for example, human form, the actual literal form of a Buddha. So Buddhas are said to be able to manifest in all three of those. It's not like you're either a Nirmanakaya Buddha or a Sambhogakaya Buddha or a Dharmakaya Buddha. If you're one, you're all three. Now that doesn't mean that you appear in those ways all at the same time. You manifest, you appear in those ways however you decide to as a Buddha. You can appear all three at the same time, one version of those at the same time, multiple versions of the Yidam type, the Sambhogakaya form. You can be in multiple forms at the same time. The Buddhas are even said to be able to manifest in multiple physical forms. So I could be a physical form of Padmasambhava, and you could also be a physical form of Padmasambhava at exactly the same time and place. Okay? So there are all of these that are a part of that. Now if you recall, going back to when we were looking at the first part of this, the ethical proposition, which was pure view, we see all beings as Buddhas. Remember? Okay? So all of us, in fact, are Buddhas. We may not have a specific name as to what Buddha we are, but if we begin to see ourselves and others as Buddhas, that's all a part of what we're doing with this tradition, and it's a part of what we do with the refuge here. One comparison that some people like to make is between these three Buddha bodies, if you will, and the Christian tradition, which most people in this country are familiar with, which has the Father, the Holy Spirit, and the Son. Okay, so the Father being God, and we don't think of God in the same way as the Christian tradition does. Excuse me. But the Holy Spirit is a little bit like the Sambhogakaya form, kind of a spirit body, if you will. And the Son, the Jesus, is also a physical manifestation. So you can see that there's at least a parallel there. They're not the exact same thing, but there is a similarity in terms of the Christian trilogy to this trilogy in the Buddhist tradition as well. Another analogy that you can think of is with water. Now water can take multiple forms. There's water in the normal form where we might drink water of some kind. But water can also be a solid, like ice. And it can also be steam, vapor. You can't see, clear. Okay? So water can be all three different forms, just as a Buddha can be all three different forms. So another kind of an analogy. It's not saying they're exactly the same, but it's an analogy. So the Buddha is within. We are the Buddha in the Tantric point of view. We just need to wake up to that and realize that we are. And as we get into the advanced practices, the generation and completion stage, that's what those are all about, is helping us to wake up, to realize that in fact that is what we are. And then taking refuge at the secret level, the other one that we talked about is to take refuge in terms of the essence, the true nature of things. So when we take refuge at that level, it is like the Dharmakaya version. We're just taking refuge in the truth, the essence, the transcendent wisdom of the Dharma, if you will. Now the third part of taking refuge is prostrations. And so when we do the prostrations, we do that as we recite the vow. And in some cases, when we're doing it in groups, we may recite that and not actually do the prostrations. But that's the idea, and when we're doing this as a part of Nundro, we certainly recite the prostrations. We do the prostrations as we recite the vow. That's part of the deal, if you will. As long as we're physically able to do that. So the way that we go about doing this, it's a way of showing reverence for the Buddha or some other deity figure, if you will, is that we begin by folding our hands together, not flat in the Anjali way where you say Namaste in India, but rather in a slightly cupped manner, and it represents a lotus bud. Okay, so that's the difference. And on the back side, the thumbs basically close the gap in between here. Okay, so we've got them in the form of a lotus bud when we're doing this. And I'll show you a full prostration here in a moment, but just describe it to start with. So we put them together at the heart, and so then, and there are some slight different versions of doing this, so if you've seen one that's a little bit different than this, that's okay too. And so we then raise them up over our head and say, I take refuge. Now in some cases we bring that down and touch the head. So I take refuge, and then at the forehead, in the Buddha, the throat, the Dharma, and at the heart, in the Sangha, most excellent. Okay? And then we do the actual prostration on the floor. So that's one way. In some cases, they will do at the top, and they will say, I take refuge in the Buddha, skip the forehead, in the Dharma and the Sangha, most excellent. Okay? So those are two different ways of doing that. Either one of those works. Or a third way is they will include the Guru. And so they start with the Guru. So I take refuge in the Guru, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Because the Guru in this tradition is the Buddha. Okay? The Buddha, the original historic Shakyamuni Buddha, is no longer here. So the Guru, the Lama, is the one that actually represents them. Even if they're slightly imperfect, they still represent that in human form for us. And so we treat them, we view them as a Buddha, regardless of what other things we may see in their behavior that we may dislike or disagree with or anything else. Okay? So that's the basic part of what we do. So I am going to move over here and demonstrate two different physical ways for doing the actual prostration.